There is something about wildfire that has always bothered me more than almost any other natural disaster. A volcano gives you a mountain to blame. A flood gives you water. An avalanche gives you snow. Fire feels different. It doesn't just move toward you, it searches. It follows wind, climbs hills, jumps roads, throws burning pieces of itself hundreds of feet ahead, and sometimes changes direction so quickly that the place you thought was safe 5 minutes ago suddenly becomes the worst place you could possibly be. And the man in this story learned that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 36 years old, worked repairing communications equipment in the mountains of Northern California, and had spent enough time in forests to think he understood wildfire. He knew what smoke meant. He knew what evacuation warnings meant. He knew not to drive toward flames. At least, he thought he knew. Then one afternoon, he found himself on a mountain road with fire behind him, fire ahead of him, a damaged truck, almost no visibility, and a wind that had suddenly changed direction. By the time Daniel understood what was happening, escaping wasn't about reaching town anymore. It was about finding 10 square meters of ground where the fire might not kill him. The story begins in late summer, during one of those brutally dry years when the forest already looks tired before anything starts burning. The grass had gone yellow weeks earlier. Pine needles covered the ground in thick, dry layers. Small creeks had shrunk into narrow streams between stones. Daniel had been working for a regional communications contractor that maintained radio repeaters and emergency equipment on remote ridges. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days involved driving long dirt roads, opening metal cabinets, replacing batteries, checking antennas, and trying not to lose tools down steep slopes. Honestly, I think that sounds fairly peaceful until the mountain decides it isn't. Daniel had grown up around forests. His father hunted. His mother worked for the county. Camping, dirt roads, chainsaws, generators, pickup trucks, none of this was unfamiliar to him. He wasn't a professional firefighter, and I think that distinction matters. Sometimes people hear that someone worked outdoors and immediately imagine some survival expert with 20 years of elite training. Daniel wasn't that. He was competent, calm, practical. The kind of person who usually had water, tools, and a first aid kit in the truck, because being stranded 50 miles from town without any of those things is annoying. But there is a very big difference between being prepared for a broken vehicle and being prepared for an entire forest to start moving toward you. That morning, Daniel had been sent to inspect a radio site near Cedar Ridge after technicians reported intermittent signal loss. The road climbed roughly 15 miles from the main highway into forested mountains. Most of it was gravel. Some sections were barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. To the west, the land dropped steeply into a river canyon. To the east, heavily forested slopes climbed toward higher ridges. Daniel drove an older 4-wheel drive utility truck carrying tools, spare batteries, 2 cases of bottled water, a fire extinguisher, and emergency equipment. At around 9 in the morning, nothing seemed unusual. Clear sky, light wind, temperature already climbing. Daniel stopped once to photograph a deer beside the road. I mention that because I always find ordinary details before disasters strangely disturbing. Somewhere there is probably a photograph taken 20 minutes before somebody's life changes completely. Bright sky, quiet forest, nothing wrong yet. He reached the radio site shortly before 10. The problem was simple: a failing power module. Daniel replaced it, tested the system, and called his supervisor over radio. While he was packing tools, he noticed a column of smoke far to the southwest. It was small, maybe several miles away. In California during fire season, smoke isn't automatically a reason to panic. Fires happen. Controlled burns happen. Vehicles catch fire. Lightning starts small incidents. Daniel radioed the office and asked if they knew anything about it. His supervisor said a brush fire had been reported near Dry Creek Road. Local crews were responding. Daniel asked whether he needed to leave immediately. The answer was no. The fire was still far from his route. Finish the work and head down. That decision sounds bad now because we know what happens next. But at the time, I probably would have done exactly the same thing. That's one thing I dislike about judging disasters afterward. Once you know the ending, every earlier decision looks obvious. It wasn't obvious to the people standing there. Daniel finished securing the equipment around 10:30. The smoke column had grown noticeably larger. Dark grey at the base, brown higher up. Then he noticed something else. The wind had increased. Pine branches were moving. Dust crossed the gravel road. He loaded the final toolbox into his truck and started down. About 15 minutes later, his radio crackled with an evacuation notice for residents near Dry Creek. Still not Daniel's location. The fire was moving northeast. Daniel was driving roughly north before the road curved east toward the highway. On paper, he was moving away from it. Then the radio transmission changed. The dispatcher said firefighters had reported rapid spread through heavy timber. Spot fires were forming ahead of the main front. Aircraft had been requested. Daniel looked through the driver's window. The smoke now covered much of the southwestern sky. He accelerated. This is where fire becomes deceptive. We imagine a wall of flame slowly approaching like something in a movie. Real wildfire can spread in complicated patterns. One hillside burns, embers travel ahead, a new fire starts. Wind pushes another branch of the fire sideways. Suddenly, the front isn't one line anymore. Daniel reached a fork in the road around 11:15. Left led toward the highway by the normal route. Right descended toward an old logging road that eventually crossed the river. Daniel took the normal route. 5 minutes later, he saw the first vehicle coming toward him, a Forest Service truck. The driver stopped beside Daniel and shouted through the window that the road ahead was closed. Daniel asked why. Fire crossed it. That got his attention. The firefighter told him to turn around and head back towards Cedar Ridge until they could identify another exit. Daniel asked about the logging road. The firefighter said he didn't know whether it was passable. Then he drove off. Daniel turned his truck around. Now think about this for a second. The road Daniel had just driven was supposedly behind the fire. The road ahead was already burning. His best option was now to drive back toward the mountain he had just left and hope someone figured out another route. I would not enjoy that. He radioed his supervisor. The signal was weak but understandable. They told him emergency crews were monitoring the area and suggested he return toward the radio site where the terrain was more open. Daniel turned north. The smoke became thicker almost immediately. At first it was just haze. Then the sunlight changed. Everything took on this strange orange color. Shadows became softer. The mountains in the distance disappeared. Daniel rolled up his windows and turned the ventilation system to recirculate. A few minutes later, small pieces of ash began falling onto the windshield. Not embers, just ash. That distinction made him feel better. It shouldn't have. Around 11:30, Daniel reached another section of road where the forest opened briefly. From there, he could see across the canyon. The entire opposite slope was burning. Not patches, an enormous section of forest. Flames were climbing through trees, and above them, a dark column of smoke twisted upward. Daniel stopped for maybe 10 seconds. He later said, that was the moment he understood the incident was much larger than he had imagined. The most frightening thing wasn't the flames. It was how fast the smoke was moving. The wind was pushing it almost horizontally. Daniel continued. Then he heard something he initially thought was thunder, a deep rushing sound. Except there were no storm clouds. It was the fire. People who have been close to major wildfires often describe the noise. Trees exploding, wind roaring, branches breaking, flames consuming vegetation so quickly that the whole thing can sound like a train. Daniel had heard fire before. He had never heard anything like this. At 11:42, his supervisor radioed again. "Wind shift reported." That sentence changed everything. The afternoon wind had begun turning from west-southwest toward the south. The fire that had been moving northeast could now be pushed almost directly toward Cedar Ridge, toward Daniel. He asked whether the logging road was open. No confirmed information. He asked whether aircraft could see his vehicle. No. Smoke had grounded at least some of the air operations. Then his radio cut out. Daniel tried again. Nothing. At this point, I think I would have started talking to myself. Probably not calmly. Daniel drove faster. The road narrowed as it entered thicker timber. Ash covered the ground like grey snow. Small branches blew across the windshield. Visibility dropped below 100 yards. Then he saw flames. Not behind him. Ahead. A small spot fire burning beside the road. Daniel stopped. The fire was maybe 30 feet across. Grass and brush burning, flames reaching into young trees. The road itself was still clear. He had a decision. Drive through quickly before it worsened, or turn around again. He chose to drive. I understand why. Every minute he waited made the road less passable. Daniel accelerated through the smoke. Heat hit the side of the truck. For several seconds, he could barely see anything except orange light and black tree trunks. Then suddenly, he was through. He looked in the mirror. The road behind him disappeared into smoke. That would have been enough for me to stop feeling confident about literally anything. Another mile down the road, Daniel came across an abandoned pickup partly blocking the lane. Driver's door open. No people visible. He stopped and shouted. No answer. He sounded the horn. Nothing. Daniel moved the abandoned truck enough to squeeze past. Then he noticed footprints in ash leading downhill. He considered following them. He didn't, and I think that was probably the right decision. He had no idea who had been in the truck or where they went. Leaving a functioning vehicle to chase unknown footprints into smoke could have turned one emergency into two. Daniel continued towards Cedar Ridge. The fire was now close enough that burning pine needles occasionally landed on the road. Those are the moments where wildfire becomes almost supernatural to watch. You can be standing in a place that hasn't burned yet, while pieces of another burning forest literally fall from the sky. A glowing ember landed near Daniel's windshield, then another, then several. He realized spot fires could start anywhere. At 11:57, he reached the radio site. The clearing around the facility was larger than the surrounding road, maybe the size of a football field, with low vegetation around the metal equipment building and antenna tower. For a moment, Daniel felt relief. Open ground. Less fuel. Maybe firefighters would direct him from here. He parked near the center and tried his radio again. A broken voice responded. He could hear only fragments. Cedar. South side. Do not. Then static. Daniel climbed onto the truck's step and looked south. The smoke had become almost completely black. He looked east. More smoke. West. The canyon was invisible. Then he looked north. Blue sky. That became the plan. The old logging road eventually curved north before descending toward the river. If Daniel could reach it, he might escape the fire's path. He checked a paper map stored behind his seat. This is another detail I like. No heroic technology. No perfect GPS route glowing on a screen. A folded paper map covered in coffee stains. The logging road joined the main route roughly 2 miles back. Daniel had driven past it. That meant returning through the spot fire. He had little choice. He filled bottles, put a wet cloth over his mouth and nose, moved the fire extinguisher into the passenger seat, and left. By now, the fire beside the road had grown dramatically. Flames climbed mature trees. Daniel could no longer safely drive through the same section. He stopped 50 yards away. He could feel heat through the windshield. He reversed. Now his planned northern escape was gone. This is the point where the title of the story becomes literal. Fire to the south, fire blocking the road north, canyon west, steep forested slope east. Daniel was surrounded. Not in a perfect circle, not yet, but every normal route out was either burning or leading toward fire. He returned to the clearing. The wind became stronger. The antenna tower began making a low metallic hum. Smoke crossed the clearing in waves. Daniel knew staying inside the forest was dangerous, but the cleared radio site might provide some protection if the fire passed around it. Then he noticed the vegetation. Dry grass, low shrubs, wooden utility poles near one edge. Not nearly as safe as he wanted it to be. Daniel started working. And I actually love this part because there is no dramatic speech, no emotional breakdown. His brain just turned everything into jobs. Move the truck away from vegetation. Remove fuel cans from the bed. Clear loose branches. Wet the ground if possible. Close windows. Prepare water. Find shelter. There was a small concrete utility structure beside the antenna equipment. Not a bunker. Basically a thick-walled equipment room with a metal door and limited ventilation. Daniel checked inside. Battery banks. Electronics. Plastic cables. Possibly toxic smoke if anything burned. But concrete walls were better than trees. He considered staying there. Then he smelled smoke from inside the structure. A cooling system had already failed. Bad option. He went back outside. At 12:15, the first spot fire appeared inside the clearing. A burning branch landed in dry grass near the southern edge. Daniel grabbed the extinguisher, ran over and put it out. Then another ember landed 50 feet away. Then another. And this is where I realized how hopeless fighting a wildfire with one fire extinguisher actually is. It's like trying to stop the ocean with a coffee cup. Daniel understood that too. He stopped chasing embers. He needed escape, not victory. Through the smoke on the western edge of the clearing, he remembered something from previous maintenance trips. A narrow service track descended toward an old gravel pit. The pit had been abandoned years earlier. Almost no trees inside it, mostly bare rock and gravel. Daniel had never driven all the way down because the road was rough. Now bare rock sounded like paradise. He found the track. It was barely visible beneath brush. He drove toward it. The truck dropped into first gear and began descending. Halfway down, a fallen pine blocked the track. Of course it did. Daniel got out and stared at it. The trunk was too heavy to move. He carried a small chainsaw in the utility box. This is one of those moments where mundane equipment suddenly becomes the most important object in your life. Daniel pulled the saw out, started it, and began cutting branches. Smoke burned his eyes. Ash covered his hair. The wind was so strong that he could hear trees cracking uphill. He cut one branch, then another. Then the chainsaw stalled. He restarted it. Stalled again. Daniel swore at it. Completely reasonable response. Eventually, he cleared enough space for the truck to climb partially onto the slope and squeeze around the fallen tree. He got back inside. Then the engine warning light came on, temperature rising. Daniel looked at the gauge. The truck was overheating. At first, he assumed the engine had a mechanical problem. Then he realized the air itself was becoming hotter. The radiator was pulling hot smoke and ash through the cooling system. He continued downhill. The old gravel pit appeared through the trees. And for maybe 10 seconds, Daniel thought he had made it. Then he saw flames on the opposite ridge. Fire was descending toward the pit from the east. The wind shift had pushed a new front around the mountain faster than Daniel expected. He was running out of mountain. The truck reached the gravel floor at around 12:30. Daniel parked near the center. The pit was roughly 200 yards across, surrounded by steep excavated walls. Sparse weeds grew between stones, but compared with the forest, there was almost nothing to burn. This was better. Not safe. Better. Daniel radioed his location repeatedly. No response. He used his phone. No service. He climbed onto a pile of gravel and looked toward the ridge. The fire was moving unbelievably fast. Flames didn't crawl downhill the way he expected. Wind drove them sideways through tree crowns. Burning embers crossed the sky. Daniel later described the color as darker than night and brighter than sunset at the same time. That sounds impossible. I know exactly what he meant. The smoke blocked the sky while the fire illuminated everything beneath it. Daniel returned to the truck and soaked spare shirts with drinking water. He wrapped one around his neck and kept another near his face. Then he moved anything flammable out of the truck bed. Aerosol cans, fuel, plastic containers, anything that could become dangerous. He parked facing the widest open section of the pit in case he had to move again. Then he waited. I think waiting might have been the hardest part. Running gives your brain something to do. Driving gives you decisions. Waiting while a forest burns toward you means watching your options disappear one by one. At 12:40, embers began falling into the gravel pit. Daniel watched small weeds ignite. He stomped them out until there were too many. The wind was now violent. Small stones and dust blew across the ground. The sound from the forest increased. The fire reached the northern rim. Trees ignited almost simultaneously. Daniel climbed into the truck, closed every window, turned off outside air, lay low below the glass. Then the temperature inside started rising, fast. The windshield reflected orange. Smoke leaked through vents despite everything he had done. Daniel covered his mouth. For a few seconds, he considered driving straight across the pit and trying another road. He could see one old exit on the far side. Then a burning tree fell across it. Decision made for him. He stayed. The first major fire front reached the pit. This is where I want to be careful, because movies make wildfire look like a clean wall of flame. Daniel's experience was messier. Wind, smoke, flying embers, trees burning in different directions, small fires starting everywhere, visibility collapsing. The air itself seemed to glow. The truck shook in the wind. Daniel heard cracking above him. He looked through the passenger window just as a burning branch slammed into the roof. The impact shattered part of the rear window. Smoke rushed inside. Now the truck was no longer sealed. Daniel had seconds to decide whether staying inside remained safer. Then flames appeared beneath the rear of the vehicle. Dry grass under the truck had ignited. Daniel grabbed his water, cloth, and emergency blanket and got out. And this is probably the moment I would have hated most. Leaving the vehicle meant giving up the last thing that felt like shelter. But staying inside a burning truck wasn't exactly a long-term plan. Daniel ran toward the center of the gravel pit. He could barely see the ground. The smoke reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. He remembered seeing a drainage trench cut along the western wall. Lower ground, possibly less radiant heat. He moved toward it. A gust of wind suddenly cleared the smoke for several seconds. Daniel looked back. His truck was surrounded by small flames. Behind it, the ridge was completely on fire. He later said that was when he finally believed he might die. Not when he first saw smoke, not when the roads closed, not when the fire surrounded him. When he saw his truck sitting there and understood there was nowhere else to go. Daniel reached the drainage ditch. It was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, lined mostly with gravel and dirt. He climbed in. The walls blocked some radiant heat. He poured a small amount of water over the cloth covering his head and neck. Then he lay flat. The fire reached its worst point. Heat rolled over the pit. Daniel described breathing as painful even through cloth. Ash filled his eyes. The roar became so loud he couldn't hear individual trees anymore. He pressed his face close to the ground where the air was slightly cooler. There is a strange survival instinct humans have where enormous problems suddenly shrink into tiny instructions. Breathe. Keep your face down. Don't stand. Protect your hands. Wait. That's it. The entire world becomes 5 seconds long. Daniel stayed in the ditch while the main front passed. He had no idea how long it lasted. Later, he estimated perhaps 12 to 15 minutes. That doesn't sound long. Try holding your hand near an oven for 15 seconds. Now imagine believing the entire world above you is on fire for 15 minutes. At one point, Daniel's jacket began smoking near the shoulder. He rolled against the gravel to put it out. His exposed hand burned when he touched a hot stone. He moved it immediately. The emergency blanket partly melted, so he abandoned it. Then the wind changed again. Not dramatically, just enough. Smoke moved east. The temperature began dropping. The roar became more distant. Daniel lifted his head. Everything was dark brown and orange. The ridge that had been covered in green forest less than an hour earlier was now rows of black trunks. Some trees were still fully burning. Others glowed at the base. Small fires dotted the gravel pit. Daniel stayed down. This is something people sometimes get wrong after fire passes. The danger isn't over because the big flames are gone. Trees fall. Ash pits remain hot enough to burn through boots. Wind can bring fire back. Smoke can kill you after the flames leave. Daniel waited another 15 or 20 minutes. Then he stood. His legs were shaking. His throat hurt. One hand was burned. His eyebrows and part of his hair were singed. But he was alive. He walked toward the truck. The rear tires had been damaged by heat. Paint had blistered. One rear window was gone. Plastic inside had partly melted. The truck would not start. Daniel tried twice. Nothing. I imagine at that point he said several words YouTube would probably prefer I not repeat. He gathered water, first aid supplies, a flashlight, and the radio. Still no signal. Now came the next problem. He survived the fire, but nobody knew exactly where he was. The forest around the gravel pit was still burning. He could not simply walk through it. So Daniel waited. By 2 in the afternoon, smoke had thinned enough to see portions of the sky. He heard aircraft. A helicopter. Daniel ran into the center of the pit and waved both arms. Nothing. The aircraft disappeared behind smoke. He found a bright emergency vest in his truck and tied it to a long piece of metal. When another helicopter passed roughly 20 minutes later, he waved it. Again, no response. This always makes survival stories more painful to me. Rescue can be close enough that you hear it and still have absolutely no way to make yourself visible. Daniel tried the radio again. This time he heard a voice, very weak. He transmitted his name, company, and location. No answer. He repeated it. Static. Then, Mercer. Copy. Daniel almost laughed. A firefighting communications unit had picked up part of his transmission from another ridge. He gave the gravel pit location. The responder told him to stay where he was if it remained safe. Daniel looked around at several burning trees and replied that safe was relative. Fair. They told him crews knew the location and would attempt to reach him when conditions allowed. Not immediately. That matters. Firefighters could not simply drive through active fire because someone had survived inside. Daniel might still have to wait hours. He treated his hand with cool water and bandages. Then he sat against a gravel pile. He had been awake and moving constantly since the first road closure. Now that the immediate danger had dropped, exhaustion hit him all at once. He started shaking. Not from cold, adrenaline. I've always found that interesting. During danger, your body can act like everything is fine because it has a job. Once the job ends, the bill arrives. Around 3:15, Daniel heard another sound. Engine. Not aircraft. Vehicle. A wildland fire engine emerged slowly down the damaged service track. 2 firefighters got out. One shouted his name. Daniel stood and raised one hand. That was the first moment he knew he was actually getting out. The firefighters checked his breathing, burns, and mental state. They gave him oxygen briefly because of smoke exposure. One looked at the burned ridge and then at Daniel's damaged truck. He asked where Daniel had sheltered. Daniel pointed toward the drainage ditch. The firefighter stared at it, then said something Daniel remembered for years. "You picked the only decent spot in this whole basin." That gives me chills, because survival sometimes comes down to skill, sometimes courage, sometimes experience, and sometimes you accidentally choose the one patch of ground that doesn't kill you. The firefighters could not immediately take Daniel back the way they came. The road was still unstable, with burning trees threatening to fall. So the 3 men waited together while crews cleared sections above them. Daniel asked how bad the fire was. Very bad. Thousands of acres already burning. Several structures destroyed. Evacuations expanding. The wind shift had surprised crews too. That detail mattered to Daniel. For hours he blamed himself for not leaving earlier. But experienced firefighters had also been forced to reposition because the fire changed faster than forecasts suggested. Eventually, shortly before sunset, crews escorted Daniel out through the burned area. He rode in the engine. The journey back showed him how close everything had been. The spot fire he had driven through earlier had become hundreds of acres of burned forest. The road where he met the Forest Service truck was black on both sides. Utility poles were down. Guardrails were twisted. Several abandoned vehicles had burned. Daniel recognized one. The pickup he had moved around. It was almost completely destroyed. Later, he learned the driver and passenger had walked downhill before the fire arrived and were rescued near the river. They survived too. Daniel reached an evacuation center that evening. Doctors treated minor burns on his hand, superficial burns on his neck, and significant smoke irritation. Considering what he had just been through, the injuries were almost absurdly small. His truck was destroyed. Most of his tools were ruined. His clothes smelled like smoke even after being washed. But Daniel walked out of the hospital the following morning. The wildfire continued burning for days. Thousands of firefighters eventually worked the incident. Homes were lost, forest was destroyed, roads remained closed. And when Daniel returned to Cedar Ridge several weeks later, he barely recognized the place. This part of wildfire stories always affects me. A volcano changes the land dramatically, and you expect it. Wildfire can leave the shape of a place exactly the same while removing almost everything you remember. The road still curved in the same direction. The mountain was still there. The radio tower remained standing, but the green forest was gone. Black trunks stood everywhere. The ground was grey. Places Daniel had driven through hundreds of times suddenly looked like another planet. He eventually walked down to the gravel pit. The truck had been removed. Burned weeds had begun growing again around the edges. He found the drainage ditch, 3 feet deep, nothing special. If you walked past it without knowing the story, you wouldn't look twice. Daniel stood there for several minutes, and I think I understand why. There are places that become important not because they are beautiful or historic or famous, but because at some point they were the only place in the world you needed. That ditch had been that for him. Years afterward, Daniel was asked what frightened him most about the fire. People expected him to say the flames. He said the wind. I think that answer tells you everything. Fire is visible, wind isn't. He could look at flames and understand where danger was. Then the wind changed, and every assumption he had made became wrong. The road that led away from the fire became blocked. The clearing that seemed safe became threatened. The gravel pit that seemed like a final escape became surrounded. His entire survival came down to repeatedly accepting that the plan he had 5 minutes earlier was no longer useful. And honestly, I think that is the biggest lesson in this story. People love survival rules. Always do this, never do that. Go uphill, go downhill. Stay with the vehicle, leave the vehicle. Find open ground. Every rule depends on what is actually happening around you. Daniel survived because he kept changing his mind. He turned around when the road burned. He drove through one spot fire when it was still possible. He refused to drive through it later when it became too dangerous. He left the truck when the truck became a trap. He stayed in the gravel pit when running would have been worse. None of those decisions sounds heroic by itself. Together, they kept him alive. And I think that is why I like stories like this more than stories where someone performs one incredible action and survives. Real survival is often ugly, confusing. You make a decision, then discover it was wrong, then make another one. Sometimes you don't know whether a choice saved you or simply delayed the next problem. Daniel started that morning repairing a radio. By lunch, he was watching the mountain burn. Less than an hour later, the road behind him was gone. Then the road ahead, then his truck. Then the air itself became dangerous. At the end, he wasn't trying to outrun a wildfire anymore. You cannot outrun a wind-driven wildfire through mountain terrain. He was trying to find a piece of earth with nothing left for the fire to eat. And somehow, he found it. That's the image I keep returning to. Daniel lying face down inside a shallow gravel ditch while an entire ridge burns above him. No heroic pose, no weapon, no perfect plan. Just a man keeping his face against the dirt because the air 5 inches above him is hotter than the air below. There are moments when survival becomes incredibly primitive. Find air, find ground, stay alive for another minute, then another, and another. By the time firefighters reached him, the mountain around Daniel Mercer looked destroyed. But he was standing, burned, covered in ash, barely able to speak without coughing, but standing. When he drove into those mountains that morning, the fire was miles away. When he first saw smoke, he thought he had time. When officials closed the road, he thought he could turn around. When he reached the radio site, he thought the clearing would protect him. When he found the gravel pit, he thought he had finally escaped. Every time Daniel believed he understood where the fire was going, the wind changed the answer. And maybe that is what makes wildfire so frightening. The flames are only half the story. The real enemy is everything controlling them. Terrain, fuel, heat, and wind, especially wind. Because when the wind changed that afternoon, Daniel Mercer didn't just lose his route home. For a while, he lost every route at once. There was fire behind him, fire ahead, fire climbing the mountain beside him, and nowhere left to run. So he stopped running. He found the one place the fire had almost nothing to burn. He got as low as he could, and while the forest disappeared around him, he waited for the fire to pass. It did. Daniel survived. And sometimes, survival really is that simple and that terrifying. Not defeating the disaster, not escaping it, but finding one tiny place where it cannot quite reach you.